My husband ditched our 20th anniversary dinner to watch a soccer match with his friends and said I would still be here tomorrow, but he had no idea what I left behind for him to find. Table 14, corner booth, a white candle burning between two empty wine glasses. 20 years deserved better than this. I wore the navy dress Trevor always loved, the one he bought me for our 10th anniversary, back when he still remembered dates without a calendar reminder. I'd had my hair done that afternoon at the salon on Brown Street, curled soft at the ends the way he used to say he liked it. I'd made the reservation myself 6 weeks in advance and asked for the same corner booth where he'd proposed half a lifetime ago in a version of this restaurant that had since been renovated twice. I ordered nothing. I waited. 7 o'clock became 7:30. The waiter came by 3 times, refilling water I didn't drink. I lied to him 3 times. He's on his way. I almost believed it myself the second time. He wasn't on his way. I called. Trevor picked up on the second ring. Behind him, a bar roared. A whistle screamed through a television speaker. Men shouted at a screen like it mattered more than anything sitting in front of them. Trevor, I said, where are you? Watching the match with the guys. Ohio State's playing, babe. It's a huge game. I stared at the empty chair across from me. The candle flickered like it was embarrassed for both of us. It's our anniversary, I said. 20 years, Trevor. He sighed. Not sorry. Annoyed like I'd interrupted something important with something trivial. You'll still be here tomorrow, he said. The game's only tonight. I turned that sentence over in my head like a rock, looking for what was crawling underneath it. Not I'm sorry. Not I'm coming right now. Just tomorrow. Like I was furniture. Like I could be put back in a closet until he had use for me again. Enjoy the game, I said, and hung up before he could hear my voice crack. I didn't cry at the table. I've never been a crier in public, not even at my own father's funeral. I ordered dinner for one. I ate the chocolate lava cake we always split, the one with the molten center that used to make Trevor laugh when it spilled onto the plate. I ate every bite alone, and it tasted strangely like a beginning. I drove home to an empty house. Our kids, Ivy and Owen, were spending the night at my sister Bianca's, 20 minutes away in Beaver Creek. I'd arranged it 3 weeks earlier, hoping for one quiet, romantic night with my husband on our 20th anniversary. The irony of that privacy wasn't lost on me as I pulled into our driveway alone at 9:40 p.m., the porch light the only thing awake in the house. I walked through every room like I was seeing it for the first time. The hallway lined with school photos I'd framed myself, one for every year since kindergarten. The kitchen where I'd cooked 20 years of dinners nobody ever thanked me for, where I'd learned to make Trevor's mother's pot roast recipe just to hear him say it reminded him of home. The couch where he fell asleep during every single movie night while I sat there, covering him with the throw blanket like something precious. I did not hate him. That was the worst part. I still don't think I hated him. Not that night. I pulled our wedding album off the shelf in the family room, the one with the cracked spine from 20 years of handling. I opened it to page 1. Trevor at 26, tuxedo slightly too big in the shoulders, eyes locked on me like I was the only thing in the room worth looking at. I remembered that version of him. I'd spent 2 decades quietly waiting for him to come back. I wrote him a letter, short. Trevor never finished anything long. Not books, not projects, not apparently dinners. I'm not leaving our marriage tonight, it said, but I'm leaving the woman who kept pretending it didn't hurt. You were right. I'll still be here tomorrow, but she won't. I took off my wedding ring. I set it on top of the letter, on the kitchen counter, under the light above the sink where he'd be sure to see it first thing. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a question. I wanted to know what he'd do with the silence. Then I drove to Bianca's, kissed my sleeping kids on the forehead, and turned my phone off for the first time in years. 20 years earlier, I was 24 years old, sitting in a lecture hall at the University of Dayton, half listening to a graduate seminar on forensic accounting while a man 3 seats down kept turning around to look at me. That was Trevor. He wasn't in the program. He was auditing the class because his roommate needed a study partner, and Trevor, even then, couldn't stand being alone in a room without an audience. He asked me to coffee before the professor finished the syllabus. I married him 2 years later, in August, in my mother's backyard in Kettering, under a tent that cost more than my first car. I believed, the way you believe things at 26, that love was a fixed quantity, something you built once and simply maintained, like a house you paid off and then just lived in. Trevor was charming in a way that made people forgive him things. He had a laugh that filled a room and a memory for other people's birthdays that made him seem thoughtful, even though I was usually the one who reminded him a week in advance. He worked his way up at Halcomb Industrial, a manufacturing supply company headquartered in Dayton, starting in outside sales and climbing over the years to regional sales director. He was good at his job. He was good at being liked. Being liked, I would learn much later, was the thing Trevor valued above almost everything else, including, it turned out, me. I built my own career in the shadow of raising 2 kids. I became a forensic accountant at Hargrove & Bell, a firm that specialized in tracing corporate fraud, hidden accounts, laundered invoices, embezzlement schemes dressed up as clerical errors. I was good at finding the things someone didn't want found. I spent my days pulling apart other people's lies, thread by thread, and then I went home and didn't look too closely at my own marriage because I didn't want to find what I was trained to find. My sister Bianca never fully trusted him, not even at the start. She stood up as my maid of honor, gave a toast that had the whole tent laughing, and 2 days later, over coffee at a diner in Kettering, she told me gently that she worried I'd married a man who needed an audience more than he needed a partner. I told her she was wrong. I told her Trevor had chosen me out of every room he'd ever walked into, and that had to mean something. She let it drop, the way sisters do when they've said their piece and don't want to be blamed for souring a marriage before it starts. She never brought it up again for 18 years, though I caught her watching him sometimes at family dinners with an expression I couldn't quite name. The first 5 years were good, or good enough that I stopped noticing the small subtractions happening underneath. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment off Wilmington Pike, the kind of place where you could hear the neighbor's television through the wall. And Trevor used to bring home carryout from the Thai place on the corner on Friday nights because he knew it was the one day I didn't have the energy to cook. He was 28 then, hungry for his career, but not yet convinced the world owed him anything for showing up in it. That version of him still asked about my day before he told me about his. Money was tighter in those years, and Trevor handled it differently than he would later. He drove the same Honda Civic for 6 years past the point his coworkers were leasing new trucks, because he said a car payment was a trap for people who needed to look successful instead of being successful. I believed him. I liked that about him. It's strange, looking back, how a person's relationship with money can tell you everything about who they'll become, years before they become it. Not the amount they spend, but what they think they're owed, and by whom. By the time Ivy was born, something had already begun to shift, quietly enough that I mistook it for the ordinary erosion every marriage goes through once children arrive. Trevor started golfing on Saturday mornings with clients, then Saturday afternoons too, then most of Sunday if the round went long and drinks followed. I told myself it was networking, an investment in his career that would eventually pay off for all of us. I didn't yet understand that a man can invest in himself for 20 years and call it investing in his family the entire time. Ivy was born when I was 28. Owen came 4 years later. Somewhere in those years, the man who used to memorize my coffee order started forgetting our anniversary unless his phone buzzed with a reminder I'd set myself. Somewhere in those years, date night became something we discussed more than we did. There was an earlier moment, 3 years before that 20th anniversary dinner, that I didn't understand as a warning until much later. Owen was 10. It was a Thursday night in October, and he woke up wheezing, his lips faintly blue, an asthma attack worse than any he'd had before. I called Trevor from the ER at Dayton Children's, my voice shaking, asking him to come. He told me he was in the middle of his fantasy football draft with the guys from work, that Owen was probably fine, that I was always the calmer one anyway. He showed up 2 hours later, after the draft ended, after Owen had already been stabilized and released with a new inhaler and a stern lecture about air quality. He brought a stuffed dinosaur from the gift shop, like that fixed it. I told myself that night was an aberration, a bad read of the situation, not a pattern. I told myself a lot of things over 20 years that I now understand were just me doing his forgiving for him in advance. There was another moment, 2 years before that I filed away without understanding it either. Ivy's kindergarten graduation was a Friday morning in May, a 15-minute ceremony in a decorated cafeteria at Oak Creek Elementary, construction paper caps, and a song about the alphabet. I'd asked Trevor 3 separate times to request the morning off. He told me, the night before, that a regional sales meeting had been moved up, and he couldn't miss it without it looking bad. I sat in the 3rd row alone, phone raised, recording 22 5-year-olds shuffling across a makeshift stage, so Trevor could watch it later on a device he never once opened. Ivy searched the crowd for him before she found me instead. She was 5. She didn't say anything about it. She just climbed into my lap afterward and asked if we could get ice cream, and I said yes, because that was easier than explaining an absence I didn't have a good explanation for myself. Around that same year, Trevor bought himself a titanium golf driver, one of those clubs that cost more than a month of Ivy's dance lessons combined. $2,200, I found out later, on a store credit card I hadn't known he'd opened. When I brought it up carefully, not as an accusation but as a question, he told me golf was part of doing business, that clients respected a man who showed up with the right equipment, that I wouldn't understand because I didn't work in sales. 2 months later, when I asked whether we could afford to move Owen from the community swim program into the more competitive one his coach recommended, an extra $60 a month, Trevor said we needed to be smarter about discretionary spending this year. I didn't connect those two conversations at the time. I connect them now, easily, the way you connect 2 entries in a ledger once you finally know what you're looking for. I want to be fair to the man I married even now, even knowing everything I know. Trevor wasn't a monster in those years. He came to most of the important things. He taught Owen to ride a bike in one long Saturday afternoon, running alongside him down Larchmont Drive, laughing so hard he could barely shout instructions. He surprised me once on a random Tuesday for no occasion at all, with a bouquet of grocery store daisies and a note that said, "You still make me nervous," which undid me completely for about a week. He was, and I think this is the part people struggle to understand about men like Trevor, genuinely capable of love. He simply wasn't capable of choosing it consistently over his own comfort, and it took me 20 years to stop mistaking the capability for the choice. About 8 months before our anniversary, Trevor announced he'd joined a new gym, stress management, he called it, laughing at himself the way he did when he wanted you to laugh along and not ask follow-up questions. It was a place called Iron Row Fitness, he said, 15 minutes from his office, convenient for lunch workouts. I remember being pleased. I remember thinking, there he is, taking care of himself, taking care of us. I never once asked to see a membership card. Why would I have? You don't audit the people you trust. That's the whole premise of trust. And it's also, I would learn, the whole mechanism by which people get away with things. His mother, Carol, had always treated Trevor like a prince who occasionally personally, charmingly misbehaved. That's just Trevor, she'd say, waving a hand whenever he showed up late or forgot something important. She said it about missed dinners. She said it about a canceled family vacation 2 years earlier when he'd decided, 4 days before departure, that he needed to stay home for a big account. She said it, I would later realize, about almost everything, because acknowledging a pattern would have meant admitting she'd raised the man who had one. I stopped expecting flowers for no reason a long time ago. I stopped expecting him to notice when I'd had a hard week. What I didn't stop doing, not once in 20 years, was showing up. I went to his company holiday parties and laughed at his boss's terrible jokes. I organized his mother's 70th birthday party single-handedly while he helped by picking a restaurant. I built our life the way I build a case file, carefully, patiently, assuming that if I did my part well enough, the whole structure would hold. I didn't know that October night in the ER or that Thursday he mentioned Iron Row Fitness, that I was collecting evidence I wouldn't understand the shape of for years. I just knew, in the specific and quiet way you know things you're not ready to say out loud, that something in my marriage had gone soft at the center, like fruit that looks fine until you press your thumb into it. 20 years. That was supposed to be the anniversary that counted. Trevor had said back in June that he was planning something. I'd let myself believe that meant something. Instead, it meant a soccer match in a corner booth with an empty chair. That night, after I turned my phone off in Bianca's driveway, I lay awake on her pull-out couch and thought about the letter sitting on my kitchen counter under the ring. I thought about the version of me who wrote it. She sounded steadier than I felt. I decided to trust her anyway. I turned my phone on the next morning at 7. 41 texts, 2 missed calls, a voicemail I almost didn't listen to. Please answer, the first text said, sent at 10:52 p.m. I read the letter. I am so sorry, said the next, sent 4 minutes later. I don't even know what to say. I've been an idiot. By midnight, the texts had shifted from panic to something that looked, on the surface, like reflection. He wrote that seeing the wedding album out on the counter, he must have noticed it was open, had broken something loose in him, that he'd been treating my love like something he already owned instead of something he'd been trusted with, that he didn't know how he'd let 20 years slide into a man who chose a soccer match over his own wife. It was well written for Trevor, suspiciously well written. I remember thinking that even as it moved me, some cold professional part of my brain, the part that spent all day comparing invoices against bank statements, noted the polish of it. Real feelings don't usually arrive that grammatically correct at midnight, but I let myself believe it, because believing it was easier than the alternative, and because I still loved him. In the stubborn, sunk-cost way you love someone you've built an entire life around. He showed up at Bianca's the next afternoon with a bouquet of white peonies, my favorite, and an apology that sounded almost rehearsed in its thoroughness. He cried. I'd seen Trevor cry maybe 4 times in 20 years. At our wedding, when Ivy was born, when Owen was born, and at his father's funeral. This made 5. I want to fix this, he said. Tell me what to do. Go to therapy, I said. Not for us, for you. I need to see you do something hard without me asking twice. He went once. A Tuesday in late July, a therapist named Dr. Okafor, whose name he mentioned exactly 1 time and never again. When I asked 2 weeks later if he'd booked a follow-up, he said work had gotten insane and he'd get back to it soon. I let it go, because letting things go was the muscle I'd trained hardest over 20 years. Ceiling 1, broken. His mother called me the following week. Carol had a way of phrasing concern that felt more like correction. I just think, she said, that you two have always had these little rough patches and you always come through them. I'd hate to see you throw away 20 years over one bad night. One bad night. As if the ER and the canceled vacation and 100 smaller absences hadn't been quietly accumulating for a decade. I told her I appreciated her concern. I did not tell her that I'd started keeping a folder, an actual manila folder, professional habit, where I wrote down dates. Not to build a case yet, just to stop gaslighting myself about the pattern. Ceiling 2, broken. In early August, Trevor told me Halcom was sending him to a client dinner on a Tuesday night. The kind of thing that happened maybe once a quarter. He texted at 6. Don't wait up, might run late. I didn't think much of it. I made dinner for the kids, graded Owen's summer reading log, and went to bed around 11, alone, the way I had 100 other nights. Ceiling 3. I didn't even know it had broken yet. That's the thing about a ceiling collapsing quietly. You don't feel the debris until later. There was a Wednesday in mid-August when Trevor came home a few minutes past 10, smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't the eucalyptus body wash he kept in our shower. I noticed it the way you notice a single wrong note in a song you know by heart, not loud but unmistakable. I asked him, as evenly as I could manage, if he'd been somewhere besides the gym. He went very still for a second, then laughed, short and sharp. Are you serious right now? After everything I've been doing to fix things since the letter, you're going to stand in our kitchen and accuse me of something like this? I didn't accuse you of anything, I said. I asked a question. It felt like an accusation, he said. Do you have any idea how hard I've been trying, Maya? I go to work, I come home, I've barely seen my own friends in a month because I'm trying to prove something to you, and this is what I get? I remember standing in the kitchen cataloging the shift in real time the way I'd catalog a suspicious transaction, the way he'd taken my question and turned it, within 4 sentences, into evidence of my unfairness instead of evidence of his behavior. It was a version of a tactic I would later recognize once I understood what I was actually looking at as one of the oldest tricks there is. Make the person asking the question feel guiltier than the person who gave them a reason to ask it. I apologized. apologized. I want to say that plainly, because it still embarrasses me. I told him I was sorry, that I was probably just anxious after everything, that of course I trusted he was telling the truth. He accepted the apology the way a king accepts a tribute, and went to bed, and I stood in the kitchen a while longer, running my thumb along the edge of the counter where the ring had sat weeks earlier, wondering when exactly I'd started apologizing for noticing things. It would be months before I understood that eucalyptus body wash had nothing to do with what I'd smelled that night, and that the gym I'd been picturing, a rack of dumbbells, a water fountain, Trevor sweating through a stress relief circuit on his lunch break, had never really been where he said it was at all. Ceiling 4. I built it back up myself, brick by brick, that same night. 2 weeks after that, we had a fight about money. I'd noticed our joint checking account running tighter than usual, a few $100s short here and there, nothing dramatic, the kind of thing you'd chalk up to inflation and back-to-school shopping. When I brought it up gently over dinner, Trevor got defensive in a way that surprised me. I've been picking up more client tabs than usual, he said. It's part of the job, Maya. You know how sales works. You can't just expense every drink. It was a reasonable-sounding answer. I let it sit. I was, by then, 3 weeks into rebuilding trust I'd half decided to give him, and questioning every dollar felt like sabotage. Ceiling 5. Ivy's senior year orientation was the following Thursday. It was a small thing, 20 minutes in the high school gymnasium, a chance for parents to meet the new counselors before the year started. I'd put it on the family calendar in June. Trevor said he'd be there. He wasn't. He texted 40 minutes in. Sorry, got stuck on a call. This account's a nightmare, ran. Ivy, 17 and sharp enough to notice everything, looked at the empty seat next to me and said quietly, "Guess I'm used to it." I remember that sentence more than almost anything else from that whole summer. Guess I'm used to it. My daughter, forgiving her father in advance, the exact way I'd taught her to by example. Ceiling 6. That one didn't just crack. It came down on top of me. I sat in the car outside the school afterward and did something I hadn't let myself do in months. I opened my laptop and pulled up our joint account statements, not as a wife looking for reassurance, but as the accountant I actually was. I looked at the pattern of small, recurring charges I'd been ignoring. Charges at a gas station 11 minutes from downtown, a payment to something called RVBD Property MGMT that I'd assumed when I'd glanced at it once before was some kind of utility fee tied to his office building. I didn't chase it that night. I just wrote the initials down in my folder, next to the date, the way I would flag a line item I intended to come back to. It was Renata Diaz who ended up connecting the dots for me 3 weeks later, though I didn't walk into her office that day expecting anything more than paperwork. I'd found Renata through a coworker who'd used her during her own divorce 2 years earlier, 19 years of family law experience, a reputation for being unshakable in a courtroom and unnervingly calm everywhere else. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a converted brick building downtown, all soft lighting and law books, the kind of place designed to make people feel steady while their lives came apart. I sat across from her desk on a Tuesday afternoon in September and told her everything: the dinner, the call, the letter, and the ring on the counter. 20 years of being placed 4th on my own husband's priority list, behind his job, his friends, and apparently a soccer match. I told her about the folder, the dates I'd started keeping, the small financial oddities I hadn't fully chased down. I told her I didn't know yet if I wanted a divorce. I told her I wanted, at minimum, to understand what I was actually dealing with. She listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small, precise cursive that looked more like calligraphy than shorthand. When I finished, she set her pen down carefully, the way you set down something you don't want to drop. "Maya," she said, "before we talk next steps, I need to ask you something." "Okay," I said. "Do you know where Trevor was last Tuesday night?" The question didn't land right away. My brain refused to translate it into anything meaningful. "Last Tuesday," I said slowly. "He texted around 6, said he had a client dinner, told me not to wait up." Renata didn't smile. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila folder, plain, unlabeled, the twin of the one sitting in my own bag. She set it face down on the desk between us. "I need you to look at this," she said, "and tell me if you recognize anything." My hand hovered over the folder for a moment longer than I expected it to. "Renata," I said, "who gave you this?" "A contact," she said quietly. "Someone who's been trying to figure out how to tell you for a while now." Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I opened the folder. The first thing I saw was a photograph printed on plain paper, slightly grainy, the kind of image pulled from a phone camera at a distance. Trevor, unmistakable. The blue jacket I'd bought him 2 birthdays ago, the one with the small tear near the cuff he refused to let me mend because he said it had character. He was sitting across a table from a woman I had never seen in my life. Her hand rested near his on the tablecloth, not quite touching, the way 2 hands sit when they're used to touching and are performing restraint for an audience they don't know is watching. The timestamp in the corner read, "Last Tuesday, 7:14 p.m., the exact hour he'd told me not to wait up. I turned the page. A hotel receipt printed from an online booking confirmation. A single night, a Marriott off I-75. An address I calculated, almost involuntarily, was 11 minutes from our house. The date matched a weekend 6 weeks earlier when Trevor had told me he was 3 states away at his college roommate's bachelor party in Nashville. My hands stayed steady. That surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that day. "How long?" I asked. "Has this been going on?" Renata looked at me the way you look look at someone right before their entire understanding of their own life tips over. Based on what I'm seeing, she said, at least 8 months. 8 months. I did the math without meaning to, the way I do math on instinct, the same way I trace a fraudulent invoice back to the exact week it started. 8 months put the beginning of it right around the time Trevor had announced his new gym membership. Iron Row Fitness. 15 minutes from his office, he'd said. Convenient for lunch workouts. I thought of every late night, every don't wait up, every bouquet of flowers he'd brought home for no occasion, guilt dressed up as romance, the kind of gesture that, I now understood, wasn't spontaneous affection at all. It was maintenance. It was patching a hole before it could be noticed. Who is she? I asked. Renata slid the last page across the desk. I registered the name before I fully processed what document I was looking at. Alexis Reyes, 34. It wasn't a hotel receipt at all. It was a residential lease agreement dated 3 months earlier for a 2-bedroom unit at a complex called Riverbend Lofts, RVBD Property MGMT. The line item I'd flagged in my own folder, sitting in my bag not 3 feet away, the one I hadn't yet had time to chase down myself. Trevor's name was printed right there on the lease beside hers, as cosigner. There was one more page beneath it, printed screenshots of a text conversation, dates spanning the past 2 months, Alexis's name at the top. I hadn't wanted to read it. I read it anyway, the way you can't help touching a burn to check if it still hurts. Can't wait for the place to feel like ours. One message read, sent on a Sunday afternoon I remembered clearly, because I'd spent that same Sunday afternoon alone, repainting the fence along our backyard while Trevor was supposedly at the office catching up on a proposal. His reply, sent 9 minutes later. Soon, just need to figure out how to handle things on my end. I don't want to blow up everything before I'm ready. Handle things, not us, not our marriage. A logistics problem he hadn't yet gotten around to solving. I know this is a lot to take in at once, Renata said, watching my face carefully. I want to be direct with you about what this means, legally, before you leave this office today. Ohio is a no-fault divorce state, which means infidelity itself doesn't automatically entitle you to more of the marital assets. But what I'm looking at here isn't just infidelity. It's dissipation. Marital funds spent on an extramarital relationship, which courts absolutely do weigh in equitable distribution. If even a fraction of what's funding that apartment is coming out of joint accounts, that changes the shape of this case considerably. It is, I said. I've already noticed one of the line items myself. I just didn't know what I was looking at until now. Renata almost smiled at that, the first real crack in her composure all afternoon. Of course you had, she said. You do this for a living. I do this for other people's marriages, I said. I never thought I'd need to do it for my own. Most people don't, she said. The ones who do tend to build the strongest cases I've ever seen, because they already know exactly where to look. I sat very still for what felt like a long time. Renata didn't rush me. Outside her window, traffic moved along Main Street the way it did every ordinary Tuesday, indifferent to the fact that my entire marriage had just been reduced to a folder of paper on a stranger's desk. Who was your contact? I finally asked. Who gave you this? Renata hesitated, which was, for a woman as composed as she was, its own kind of answer. Her name is Priya Sethi, she said. She works in Halcom's HR department. Alexis Reyes reports to Trevor. Priya's been fielding complaints about the two of them for months. Nothing anyone would act on formally, just enough for her to start asking questions on her own. When she found out who Trevor's wife was, through mutual friends, she came to me instead of going straight to you. She wasn't sure how to have this conversation herself. A reporting relationship. Trevor's mistress wasn't just someone he'd met at a bar. She worked for him. She was, on paper, subordinate to him, in a company with an HR policy I'd once heard him complain about at a dinner party, mocking it as corporate hand-holding. I left her office that afternoon with both folders pressed together inside my bag, hers and mine, fitting now like halves of the same document. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I didn't cry in Renata's office, the same way I hadn't cried at the restaurant. I asked for copies of everything. I asked her what my options were. And somewhere underneath the shock, in the same cold, methodical part of my brain that traced fraud for a living, a plan had already started assembling itself, line item by line item, the way it always did when I found the things someone didn't want found. I didn't confront Trevor that night. I want to be honest about that because I think it's the part of this story people find hardest to believe, that I sat across the dinner table from him 3 nights in a row, watched him kiss our kids goodnight, watched him complain about a client, and said nothing. I wasn't protecting him. I was building a case. I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I do best. I pulled 6 months of statements from our joint accounts, cross-referencing every withdrawal against the calendar of Trevor's supposed work trips, late nights, and client dinners. I found a recurring $1,400 monthly payment to RVBD Property MGMT, dating back exactly to the month the Riverbend lease began, money he'd been quietly siphoning from a joint savings account we'd opened for a kitchen renovation we never started. I found a separate credit card, opened in his name only, statements mailed to his office instead of our house, with a balance of $9,600 in restaurant charges, a jewelry store I didn't recognize, and 2 more hotel stays. I found, through public property records I had every legal right to pull, that the total amount funneled toward that apartment and its furnishings over 8 months came to just over $34,000. Our money. Money that was supposed to become a kitchen with the marble countertop I'd been saving photos of for 2 years. I told Renata I wasn't ready to file yet. I wanted to be certain the picture was complete before I let it move. She understood. She'd seen enough clients act too early, tip their hand, and lose the advantage of surprise. Some people need to confront their spouse the moment they find out, she told me. Others need to know exactly what they're confronting first. There's no wrong way to do this, but you strike me as someone who prefers to know the whole ledger before you close it. She wasn't wrong. I kept the ring off. I told Trevor I needed space to think, that I wasn't ready to talk yet, and he, desperate, I think, to believe the crisis was passing, didn't push. He assumed my silence meant I was healing. I let him assume that. I spent my evenings, after the kids were asleep, printing bank statements and property records, building a timeline the way I would for any client whose fraud I'd been hired to expose, except this client was my husband, and the fraud was my marriage. The confrontation happened on a Sunday, 3 weeks after I opened that folder in Renata's office. It was Carol's 71st birthday, hosted, as it always was, at Trevor's parents' house in Oakwood. A gathering of maybe 15 people, Trevor's siblings and their families, a few old family friends, a table full of the pot roast I'd learned to make for exactly this kind of occasion. I chose the setting deliberately. Trevor had spent 20 years being protected by an audience that adored him. I decided it was time that same audience saw him clearly, just once. I waited until after the cake, until Carol had opened her gifts and the room had settled into that loose, satisfied, quiet families get after a meal. Trevor was telling a story about a golf outing, mid-laugh, when I set a single sheet of paper on the table in front of him. Not the whole folder, just the lease agreement. His name and Alexis Reyes's name printed side by side. The room went quiet the way a room does when it senses something has shifted before it understands what. "What is this?" Trevor said, but his voice had already changed. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man realizing the floor had been rigged to drop out from under him precisely when he felt safest. "Riverbend Lofts," I said. "Unit 214. You've been paying for it out of our renovation savings since February. I have 8 months of documentation, Trevor. I know about the Marriott. I know about Nashville. I know Alexis reports directly to you at work." Carol's fork hit her plate. Trevor's father, Walt, a quiet man who rarely inserted himself into anything, set down his coffee cup with a deliberate, controlled precision that was somehow louder than if he'd dropped it. His younger sister, Meg, put a hand over her mouth. "Trevor," Walt said, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man who has almost never used it to discipline his son, and is discovering late that he probably should have. "Tell me this isn't true." "Maya, this isn't the place," Trevor said, low, urgent, glancing around the table like the walls themselves might still be persuaded to side with him. "You're right," I said. "It's not. But you took the place that was supposed to matter. Our anniversary, table 14, a candle burning for 2 hours while I waited for you to choose me over a soccer match. So I don't think I owe you a better venue than the one you chose for yourself." "You don't understand what's been going on with me," he said. And there it was, the pivot I'd watched him make my whole marriage, the turn toward his own suffering whenever anyone else's was inconvenient. "I've been under so much pressure. Alexis, she listens. She doesn't come at me with spreadsheets the second I walk in the door." I felt something in me go very quiet and very clear, the way a room does right before a storm actually breaks. "I have never once come at you with a spreadsheet," I said. "I built our whole life with spreadsheets, Trevor, because somebody had to keep the lights on while you were busy being liked. You didn't leave because I made you feel small. You left because being fully seen by one person for 20 years started to feel like more effort than being adored by someone new." His mother, to her credit, the first time in 20 years I'd seen her do this, didn't rush to smooth it over. "Trevor," Carol said, and her voice cracked on his name. "Is this true?" He didn't answer her. He looked at me instead, and for 1 second, something in his face wasn't performance anymore. It was closer to fear. "Maya, please," he said. "Let's talk about this at home." "There's nothing left to talk about at home," I said. "I already told you the night of our anniversary. You said I'd still be here tomorrow. I was. But I spent every one of those tomorrows finding out exactly who you'd become. I'm done being the woman who waits for you to notice her. I filed the paperwork Thursday." I hadn't planned to say that last part out loud. Not there, not that day. But it was true, and it felt, in that moment, like the only sentence in 20 years I'd said entirely for myself. I picked my purse up off the back of the chair and left before he could recover enough to answer. Meg followed me out to my car. She didn't say much. She just hugged me, hard, in the driveway and said, "I always knew there was something off about that gym." The weeks that followed moved the way I imagine a controlled demolition moves. Loud, fast, and in a direction nobody could stop once the charges were set. Trevor moved into the Riverbend apartment permanently within 4 days, which told me everything I needed to know about how much thought he'd put into whether he actually wanted to save our marriage or simply wanted to avoid the discomfort of losing it publicly. Alexis Reyes, I learned later, hadn't known Trevor was married when things started. She found out 3 months in when a coworker mentioned Trevor's wife by name at an office happy hour. By the time the lease was signed, she knew exactly what she was signing on to. But I've tried, in the years since, not to spend my anger on a 34-year-old woman who was lied to first and used second, the same as I was. Alexis resigned from Halcom before the investigation concluded, according to Priya, rather than sit through a formal review of a relationship she'd entered believing she was the second act of someone's life, instead of a secret running parallel to the first. I never spoke to her directly, and I never intended to. Whatever accounting she owed it to herself, not to me. me. Halcom Industrial opened an internal HR investigation into the supervisory relationship within 2 weeks of Priya Sethi's formal complaint. Trevor was placed on administrative leave in October and quietly let go by December, his severance smaller than it should have been because the company's counsel determined his conduct violated the employee fraternization clause he himself had once mocked. He lost the corner office. He lost the expense account. He lost within 4 months almost everything he'd built a decade of charm around, and I want to be honest, there was a part of me that felt something close to satisfaction watching that particular ceiling collapse on him, the way he'd let so many ceilings collapse on other people without noticing. Carol called me twice in November. The first time, she apologized. Really apologized. Not the deflecting kind of concern she'd offered me over the phone that summer. I spent 30 years excusing that boy, she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I think I taught him the world would always catch him. I'm sorry it was you who finally didn't. The second call, she asked if she could still see the kids on weekends sometimes, separate from Trevor's custody time, and I said yes, because Ivy and Owen loved their grandmother, and I refused to let their father's failures cost them a relationship that had nothing to do with him. Ivy took it hardest, in her own quiet way. 17 is old enough to understand exactly what infidelity means, and young enough to still want, somewhere underneath the anger, for her parents to have been who she thought they were. She didn't speak to her father for 6 weeks. When she finally did, over a stiff, awkward lunch I encouraged her to attend, she came home and told me, he kept talking about how hard this has been for him. I didn't say anything. I let her arrive at that conclusion on her own, the way I'd had to. She came into my room late one night in December, sat on the edge of my bed the way she used to when she was small and couldn't sleep, and asked me the question I'd been waiting for since the birthday party. Did you know, she said, before you found out for real? Like, did some part of you already know? I thought about lying to make it simpler. I didn't. I think some part of me had noticed things for years and decided not to look at them too closely. I said, I'm not proud of that. I spent my whole career finding the truth in other people's numbers, and I didn't want to find it in mine. That's not the same as knowing, Ivy said. Fierce in the way only a 17-year-old defending her mother can be fierce. No, I said, but it's close enough that I promised myself I'd never do it again. Not to myself and not to you. She was quiet for a while after that. Then she said, I don't want to be like him. I don't want to need people to think I'm great more than I need to actually be honest with them. You won't be, I told her. You already noticed the difference. That's most of the work right there. She fell asleep on top of my covers that night, the way she hadn't done since she was maybe 9, and I lay awake a long time afterward, grateful, in a way I hadn't expected to be, that at least one relationship in this story was still being built on the truth instead of around it. Owen, 14, processed it more privately, spending long stretches in his room, and I found out 3 weeks later, from his school counselor, that he'd been struggling to sleep. I took him to see someone, a real therapist, the kind Trevor had visited exactly once, and sat in the waiting room every Thursday for months, determined that at least one parent in this story would show up consistently for the hard things. Bianca showed up at my house the Tuesday after the birthday party with 2 bags of groceries and a bottle of wine she didn't open, because she said she wanted to be useful, not blurry. She sat at my kitchen table while I finally told her everything, start to finish, the dinner and the letter and the folder and the lease. She listened the way Renata had, without interrupting, and when I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. I hate that I was right, she said. I've hated it since that toast 18 years ago. I would have given anything to have been wrong about him. You weren't wrong, I said. You were just early. She came over twice a week after that, sometimes to help with the kids, sometimes just to sit with me while I sorted through financial documents at the kitchen table, a second set of eyes checking my math even though she'd be the first to tell you she'd never been good with numbers. She wasn't there for the math. She was there so I wouldn't be doing it alone. I met Priya Sethi in person about 3 weeks after the confrontation at Carol's, at a coffee shop on Far Hills Avenue, at her request. She was younger than I'd pictured, maybe 32, with the careful, watchful manner of someone who spends her professional life documenting things other people would rather she didn't notice. I want you to know I didn't go looking for this, she told me, turning her cup in slow circles on the table. Alexis mentioned him constantly, long before I put together who he was married to. Little things, an inside joke, a nickname, a weekend trip she said was work, except she doesn't travel for work. It took me a while to be sure enough to say anything to anyone. I know it doesn't undo anything. I just didn't want you finding out some other way or not finding out at all. You didn't owe me anything, I said, and I meant it. But thank you. For what it's worth, she said. He wasn't as careful as he thought he was. People at the office knew. Not everyone. Enough. That detail sat with me for days afterward. The idea that I had been, for months, the only person in the entire story who didn't know the shape of my own life. I'd spent 20 years assuming that if something were seriously wrong, I would be the first to sense it, given what I did for a living, given how closely I paid attention. It turned out attention isn't the same as access. You can watch a room carefully and still miss the thing happening in a room you were never invited into. Alexis Reyes's older sister, a woman named Priscilla, reached out to me in late October, through a mutual acquaintance, asking, almost apologetically, if we could talk. I almost said no. I sat with the request for 2 full days before I agreed, mostly out of the same instinct that made me good at my job, an unwillingness to leave a thread unpulled. We met at a diner off Wilmington Pike. Not far, I realized halfway through the conversation, confrontation from the apartment Trevor and I had lived in during our first years of marriage. Priscilla was younger than me by almost a decade, anxious in the way people are when they've rehearsed an apology in the car and aren't sure it will survive contact with the person it's meant for. "I'm not here to defend him," she said. "I want to be clear about that, but I don't think you know the whole story, and I think you deserve to." She told me Trevor had told Alexis in the earliest months that he was already separated, that he and his wife had been living, in his words, as roommates for over a year, that the divorce paperwork was simply a formality he hadn't gotten around to filing. Alexis had believed him, the same way I'd believed the eucalyptus body wash, the same way I'd believed the gym membership, the same way 20 years of small, plausible lies had taught me to believe almost anything that came wrapped in enough specific, boring detail to sound true. It wasn't until the office happy hour, until a coworker mentioned my name and my job and our kids by name, that Alexis understood she hadn't been the other woman in a broken marriage. She'd been a second wife to a man who was still, very much, married to his first. "She's not proud of any of this," Priscilla said. "But she didn't know. Not at the start. I thought you should hear that from someone besides him." I believed her. I still believe her. It didn't make the 8 months hurt less, but it rearranged, slightly, where I placed the anger. Less at a stranger who'd been lied to alongside me. More, entirely, at the man who'd built an entire second life out of the same easy, well-rehearsed dishonesty he'd used to build the first one. Owen's therapist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Reyes, no relation, a coincidence that made Owen laugh nervously the first time he noticed it, told me, after the third or fourth session, that 14-year-olds often process a parent's betrayal by directing their anger inward first, blaming themselves for not noticing sooner, the way I had. Owen started sleeping again by December. He also started asking me, unprompted, small logistical questions about the divorce, where he'd live, whether he'd change schools, whether Trevor would still come to his baseball games, and I answered every one of them as plainly and honestly as I could, because I'd promised myself that first Tuesday night on Bianca's pull-out couch that whatever else came apart in this story, my children would never again have to guess at the truth. There was a Tuesday in November, kids at school, house empty, when I finally let myself grieve properly. I sat on the kitchen floor with the wedding album, the same one that had cracked open something in Trevor for exactly as long as it took him to reoffend, and I cried for the first time since that night at the restaurant. Not for the marriage exactly. By then I understood the marriage, as I'd believed it to be, had probably been dying quietly for years before I found the folder. I cried for the 26-year-old in the photographs, the one who believed love was something you built once and simply lived inside forever. I cried for the version of Trevor in that same photograph, the one who might have become the man I thought I married if he'd ever had to. The financial complications took most of the winter to untangle. Renata used the $34,000 I'd traced to the Riverbend apartment as leverage in the settlement, arguing successfully that Trevor had committed marital waste, using shared assets to fund an affair, which Ohio courts consider when dividing property. We sat across a conference table from Trevor and his attorney in January, a mediation session that ran nearly 4 hours, Renata laying out the timeline, the lease, the credit card statements, the $2,400 monthly payments to RVBD Property MGMT, one document at a time, methodical as a closing argument. Trevor's attorney, a tired-looking man named Mr. Feldkamp, tried twice to characterize the Riverbend payments as a temporary living arrangement necessitated by marital breakdown, as though the apartment had appeared after the affair instead of funding it. Renata didn't raise her voice. She simply slid the lease agreement across the table, dated months before I'd written a single word of that letter on the kitchen counter, and let the date speak for itself. "The timeline doesn't support that characterization," she said. "I'd encourage your client to reconsider before we take this in front of a judge, instead of a mediator." Trevor didn't look at me once during those 4 hours. I kept the house. Trevor's already reduced severance, combined with the settlement, meant his new apartment, still Riverbend, still Unit 214, though Alexis had moved out by January, cost him considerably more of his shrinking income than he'd bargained for. He made one more desperate move in February, showing up unannounced at my office at Hargrove and Bell on a Wednesday afternoon, half apologetic, half accusatory, trying to convince me to reconsider the custody arrangement in the parking lot before I'd even reached the lobby doors. "You're punishing me," he said. "Taking the kids 2 weekends out of 3. Taking the house. Maya, this is my life too. I made a mistake. People make mistakes. People make mistakes." I agreed. "They don't usually sign a 2-year lease for their mistake and pay for it with our renovation fund. So that's it then. 20 years and you're just done being reasonable." "I was reasonable for 20 years, I said. "You mistook it for permission." He hinted, standing there in the February cold, that he might fight for more time with the kids if I didn't ease up on the financial terms, the way a man threatens a fire he's not actually willing to set, hoping the threat alone does the work. I told him, calmly, that I had 8 months of documented evidence, an HR investigation with his name already on it, and a forensic accounting background that meant I could produce, on 48 hours' notice, every dollar he'd ever hidden, going back years if a judge wanted me to. I told him Ivy and Owen had already told the guardian ad litem, on their own, unprompted, which parent they trusted to tell them the truth. He didn't fight the custody arrangement. He signed everything Renata put in front of him by March. There is a version of this story where the ending is simpler than the one I actually got. I wish I could tell you I felt nothing but triumph the day the divorce was final. finalized in May, 8 months after that folder landed on Renata's desk. What I felt instead was quieter and more complicated, relief mostly, but relief with an undertow of grief running beneath it, the way you can be glad a wound has finally been cleaned even while it still aches. I still have the house on Larchmont Drive, the one with the hallway of school photos, though I repainted the kitchen a pale sage green that summer, a color Trevor never would have chosen. I got a promotion at Hargrove and Bell that fall, moved into a senior forensic role tracing corporate fraud cases across 3 states. Work I find, more than ever, genuinely satisfying. There is something clarifying about spending your professional life finding the truth hidden inside numbers, after spending 20 years not looking too closely at your own. Owen had a baseball game last month, a Tuesday doubleheader against Centerville, and Trevor showed up for the second game, late, sliding into a folding chair 3 rows behind the dugout instead of beside me the way he used to. I watched him watch his son hit a double down the left field line, watched him stand and clap along with everyone else, and I felt, for the first time in almost 2 years, something close to neutral. Not warmth, not anger, just a man in the bleachers who used to be my husband, cheering for a kid we made together, in a life that had rearranged itself around both of us without either of us fully agreeing to it. Ivy is a freshman at Ohio State now. She calls every Sunday and we talk about everything except her father unless she brings him up first, which she does less and less. Owen, 16, plays baseball and sleeps fine most nights. Trevor sees them every other weekend, and I've learned, slowly, to let that relationship be theirs to navigate, separate from mine. I ran into Carol at the grocery store last spring. She hugged me longer than she needed to, and told me she was proud of who I'd become, which felt, coming from her, like its own strange kind of closure. Last September, almost exactly a year after that night at table 14, Bianca talked me into going back to Marchetti's for my 45th birthday, just the 2 of us. I hadn't been back since. The hostess sat us 3 tables away from the old booth, and I caught myself looking at it anyway, at the couple sitting there now. A young man refilling his date's wine glass, neither of them checking a phone. I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was still tight. I ordered the chocolate lava cake. Out of some instinct, I didn't examine too closely, and I ate the entire thing myself, and it tasted, this time, like nothing more complicated than dessert. I've kept the folder, the real one, the one I built over those 3 weeks in September, timelines and statements and property records. Renata told me most of her clients ask her to shred everything once a case closes. I asked to keep mine, not out of spite. I think I keep it the way I imagine surgeons keep the first scan of a tumor they removed, proof not of what was lost, but of what I was capable of finding and dismantling once I finally let myself look. I think about that sentence sometimes. You'll still be here tomorrow, the way you think about a wound that's healed, but left a mark you can still find with your fingers if you go looking. He meant it as a dismissal. He meant that I was fixed, permanent, a given, something that didn't require effort because it would simply keep existing whether he showed up for it or not. He was right in the end, just not in the way he thought. I was still here tomorrow. I'm still here now. But the woman who waited at table 14 for 2 hours, who ate cake alone and called it fine, who spent 20 years doing everyone else's forgiving in advance, she isn't the one who stayed. I left her at that table the same night I left the ring on the counter, and I've never once gone back for her. What I know now, that I didn't know at 26 under that tent in my mother's backyard, is that love isn't a thing you build once and simply live inside forever. It's a thing you keep choosing on purpose, on the nights it's inconvenient, especially on the nights it's inconvenient. Trevor chose a soccer match. I understand now that he'd been choosing other things, quietly, for years before that. His own comfort, his own image, a woman who didn't ask him to be better than he already was. Some evenings I still sit at the kitchen table on Larchmont Drive, long after the kids have gone to bed or driven back to their own lives, and I open a case file from work instead of a glass of wine, tracing someone else's hidden numbers back to the exact week the lie began. I used to think that habit was an escape from my own life. I understand it differently now. It's practice. It's the same instinct that finally let me look clearly at the one ledger I'd spent 20 years too afraid to audit. I don't know if I'll fall in love again. Some days I think I'd like to. Some days the idea feels like more risk than I have left in me. Bianca tells me I'll know when it's worth the risk again, that I'll recognize the difference between a man who shows up and a man who's good at explaining why he didn't. I think she's probably right. She usually is. But I know, whatever comes next, that I won't spend the next 20 years waiting at a table for someone who tells me I'll still be there tomorrow, as if my presence were the only thing about me worth counting on. I was there tomorrow, and the tomorrow after that, and every ordinary tomorrow since. It just wasn't for him anymore, and it hasn't needed to be for a long time now.